Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Anderson, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in Nashville, Tennessee. I recently had the opportunity to speak to the Female Boss Collective, also here in Nashville, Tennessee, on the topic of difficult conversations. And the talk was really well received. In fact, so much that several people reached out and asked if I wouldn't mind recording it so that they could watch it whenever they wanted. So that is what I'm doing for you today. So, when they teach you in grad school, one of the things that they don't actually tell you is that a primary role of a therapist is to engage in difficult conversations every single day. These conversations might be difficult because of the content, such as trauma or difficult relationships. The conversations might be difficult because of the people involved. Sometimes it's a partner telling their spouse that they're not satisfied in the relationship, or maybe even that they want to end it. Or there's a lot of difficult conversations that I have to have because maybe the client that I'm working with isn't having words and actions that line up to one another. And so we have to talk about it. But difficult conversations are definitely a part of what I do on a daily basis. So I want you to just think for a moment. Do you know anybody, including yourself, that really, truly loves difficult conversations? Like they run towards conflict, they enjoy the discomfort of that moment, and they're not affected by anything that was said in that conversation. So just think, anybody that you know? Likely the answer is no. Most of us don't really love having those types of conversations, but that is definitely what we are going to be talking about for the remainder today. So to start off, we're actually going to talk about the brain. And I know that sounds like a weird place to start when we're talking about conversations, but it is important. And I promise you that this is not going to be like your typical science lesson. I'm just going to give you the basics. I'm going to make it as easy to understand as I possibly can. And hopefully you can tell by the drawing of a brain that I have right here that it really isn't going to be a science lesson. I mean, I know that I'm not an artist, but this is clearly not what the brain looks like. But for the purposes of this talk, this will do. So we're going to talk about three different parts of the brain: the reptilian part of the brain, the mammalian part of the brain, and the neocortex. Okay, so the reptilian part of the brain down here, this is the part of the brain that is present from the moment that we're born. This part of the brain scans constantly for danger and for threats. It never sleeps. It's always on 24/7. This is the part of the brain that performs a lot of our automatic functions like breathing and balance, body temperature control, heart rate, those sorts of things. Sometimes this part of the brain can be considered rigid or compulsive, but that's because it's always looking for danger. And while the goal here isn't to get super psychological, it's also important to note that danger is very subjective. So what might feel like danger to you may or may not to me. A good example of that might be perhaps you're scared of dogs. And so you're walking down the road and you see a dog in a yard that doesn't have a fence and the dog doesn't have a leash, and you might start to notice that your heart rate quickens, or maybe you want to walk faster because that's something that feels very scary or endangering to you. But another person might walk down the same road and they see a dog in a yard without a fence on a leash, and they actually think that's really great. And they may even try to get the dog to come over to them or to pet them or play with them. And so you can see that danger isn't the same for everyone. We all have a very subjective view of what danger is for us. But our brain, that reptilian part of the brain, is constantly scanning for danger. So the next part of the brain right here is the mammalian part of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that usually starts to develop by age 6 or 7. This can record and remember positive and negative experiences, also emotion. It works very close in contact with our reptilian part of the brain. And so, like I said, that part of the brain is constantly scanning for danger. And what the mammalian part of the brain does is try to figure out what to do when that danger arises. So this part of the brain is also the seat of our subconscious and unconscious choices and value systems, and it often makes snap judgments very quickly in a situation. And the reason it does that is because this is the part of the brain that is always trying to keep us surviving. Okay, so if the brain senses danger, this part goes into motion and tries to figure out what should we do with that danger. This part of the brain, the mammalian part of the brain, is constantly in the present moment. It is all about surviving, and it isn't thinking ahead. It's not thinking about consequences. It's just trying to keep us alive. So a lot of us have already heard of the mechanisms that this part of the brain would use in order to keep us alive. That would be fight, flight, or freeze. These are the coping skills that the mammalian part of the brain uses when danger arises. So if you think about maybe most of you have probably watched something on like Animal Planet or National Geographic, or maybe even a YouTube video, maybe where like a lion is chasing a gazelle or some sort of predator is chasing a prey. So animals actually have the same coping mechanisms as the mammalian part of the brain, and in fact, this part of the brain is often considered to be very animalistic. So if we're watching that video of the predator chasing the prey, we'll see the prey doing one of three things, or maybe a couple of them. We might see them fighting. So they actually fight the animal that is trying to make them their meal, and they try to kill them before they're killed, okay? They also might take flight or flee the situation. And so they'll literally run away from the animal that is trying to eat them for dinner. And then the third thing that they might do is freeze. So essentially they play dead. So their heart rate slows down and their breathing gets really shallow. And the purpose of that coping mechanism for them is hopefully that the animal that is wanting to eat them would be uninterested in an already dead meal. So we use these as humans too, fight, flight, or freeze, but I will make one caveat, is that most humans aren't afraid of being eaten by other humans. But we do these things, we fight. So that means sometimes we'll use our words and even our body to become physically or verbally aggressive with someone. We might use body movements, maybe crossing our arms, or even our facial expressions like resting bitch face, which I can't do, but we would use those to become physically threatening or intimidating or to fight. And sometimes we might even use our position, say as a boss or a manager, to be in a position where we could be more threatening and intimidating. As humans, we might also take flight, and that might mean that we literally run away from the situation at hand by making an exit. Sometimes fleeing a situation means that we disassociate from our body. So we're physically present in the moment, but it's like our mind is a million miles away. Other times we take flight by kind of burying our head in the sand and trying to just ignore the situation, and hoping that like by the time we come back to the present moment, everything will have changed and everything will be okay. And then the third form of coping that we engage in is freezing. And so for most of us, like animals, we don't usually drop dead in a situation. Although that could be a legitimate way of getting out of a difficult situation because, then the ambulances are called and, all of those sorts of things. But typically we don't do that. We don't even fake playing dead. But it might feel like our communication or our tongue or our mind or our feet are dead or frozen. So it might look like we want to know, or we think we know what we would want to say, but we just can't get those words out of our mouth, or we'd like to leave the situation, but we can't get our feet to move. So just as full disclosure, freezing in a situation is my primary coping mechanism, the one that I go to when I'm in conflict or high chaos or feeling very, very overwhelmed. And this is actually something that I've had to work on for quite some time, to be remaining present and trying to be engaged in a conversation. And this coping mechanism of freezing is actually one of the hardest for the other person that you're engaging with, because no amount of dancing around or trying to get you to talk or waving or making threats or accusations can pull you out of this freeze state. So those are the coping mechanisms that our brain, that mammalian part of the brain, this one right here, uses whenever danger is perceived. And it's important to know too that part of the brain is is a very rationalizing part of the brain. So it can rationalize its words and actions whenever danger is perceived, because again, its primary role is to keep us safe. But it is important to note that while it can rationalize, it's not a rational part of the brain. And so a good example of understanding what this means would be if you think about maybe a child or an adolescent, they primarily function out of these two parts of the brain right here, because their neocortex, which is the next part of the brain that we'll talk about, isn't fully developed yet. And so you think about a kid who they can have the most they can rationalize anything, any idea, thought, whim, or whatnot, and they can rationalize it, they can justify it until they're blue in the face, but it's not necessarily rational. So that's a good way of thinking about the mammalian part of the brain. And then the final part of the brain right here is the neocortex, which is sometimes also called the Einsteinian part of the brain. And this is the part of the brain that starts to develop later on in life, so into your adolescence, and really isn't finished developing until your mid to late 20s. This part of the brain is considered to be very logical and rational and adult. This is the part of the brain that helps us with language development and moderate our impulsive behaviors, modify other behaviors also, helps us make decisions, helps us to be able to learn infinitely. And this part of the brain likes to take credit for everything that we do. It actually truly believes that it makes 90% of our daily decisions. It believes that, but that's actually not what happens. And the reason why is because these bottom two parts of the brain, the reptilian and mammalian part of the brain, they're constantly scanning for danger. Those two parts of the brain are typically where we make our decisions from, especially when we feel that there's a threat, conflict, something's wrong, that sort of thing. So I know I've said the word threat and danger quite a few times, and I think it's important to start to define what is that actually. And so when we talk about that in this case, threat or danger happens when we're trying to get the question answered of, do I belong? Okay. So as humans, we are created for relationships, and that's something that's very clearly shown in research. And so we are constantly, in everything that we do and say and interactions that we have, doing it with the intent of getting at least one of 6 needs met. And these are the 6 basic needs that we have as humans. Okay, I'm going to just go through them fairly quickly. I'm not going to hold this up, but you can see belonging, autonomy, safety, security, self-expression, purpose or significance, and connection. So belonging is going to be, do I have stable, long-term, frequent, positive interactions with the same person? Am I loved by another person that I can trust? Autonomy is, am I safe to be independent and not controlled by somebody else? Safety and security means it means physical safety and security, but goes beyond that. It actually means emotional safety and security as well. Self-expression is, am I safe to be me? Can I express my feelings and my thoughts and my ideas in a free way? Purpose and significance. So, do I matter? Why am I here? What role do I play? And then connection. Am I connected to others who love and care about me? Do I feel valued and supported and loved? So these are the basic needs that as humans, we try to have met in order to thrive fully. So perceived danger or conflict then comes when one of these 6 needs is not being met, or when the need that I'm trying to get met is not the need that you're trying to get met, and then conflict ensues. So we're going to go back to that example of the teenager again, and we'll use that throughout. But you think about if you're a parent of a teenager, or maybe you have a sibling who's a child or teenager, or you babysit, or you're a teacher, you know teenagers, okay? Oftentimes, our need as the older adult, our need for connection can sometimes bump up against their need for autonomy. And when this happens, conflict ensues. So there's maybe an argument, or one of you actually leaves the situation or goes silent. So when we're not getting our needs met, we start to scheme as to how we can get our needs met. And that's where the reptilian and mammalian part of the brain come back into contact, and they start scheming to make sure that those perceived needs that aren't being met do get met. So, and they want to alleviate that threat. And so that's where we start to argue or blame or accuse or take below the belt hits or blow up, blow things out of proportion, leave the situation. Fight, flight, or freeze. That's what happens. So I want to come back to this picture of the brain, and I want to just take a look at what happens when the brain starts to sense that some sort of threat or conflict is there. And I'm going to show you this picture, and you notice it's just a little bit different. So when our reptilian or mammalian part of the brain right here start to sense danger, the neocortex part of the brain actually starts to disconnect from the rest of the brain, and it goes offline. So I want you to just take a moment and think about a time where you may have felt scared or endangered, or maybe you were being accused of something, or you were in an argument, maybe somebody was attempting to control you, or you felt unsafe or physically unstable or emotionally unstable. So think about a situation like that where you were in it, and then think about what your response was in that situation. And as you think about that response, I want you to just think, in that moment, were you able to respond calmly and rationally? Were you able to process through the situation and understand what was going on? Maybe see things from the other person's perspective, or identify a logical solution, or speak with compassion and empathy? Unfortunately, most of us answer no to that question or those questions. And it's possible to do those things. It's possible to be able to respond with compassion and empathy, but it's actually really uncommon to do so unless you've worked on that skill specifically. And I would venture to say that for most of us, when that threat comes our way, we automatically implement one or more of those coping mechanisms of fight, flight, or freeze. And so we might find ourselves trying to prove our point, or engaging in arguments, maybe getting defensive. Maybe we get embarrassed and we, look away, or we look for a way to leave the situation, or we get really, really quiet and we hope that the other person will just leave. Those are our actual typical responses when we sense that danger is there. So even despite our best effort to remain calm, cool, and collected, the majority of us go to one of these very primitive coping mechanisms. And that's because the neocortex part of the brain, right? This part here that believes that it makes 90% of our daily decisions, is offline completely. It's disconnected. And in fact, research shows that when that part of the brain disconnects and goes offline, it can actually take up to 20 minutes to come back online and then be able to kind of make solutions from there. So for those of you who say you need a minute when conflict ensues or when something's really overwhelming, there's actually a lot of truth to this. We actually do need time to calm down when that threatening situation comes to us, and start to recognize that we're not in danger, we're not being threatened, and we need that in order to give the neocortex time to come back online and then be able to implement logic and rationality and empathy and thinking of things from other people's perspective. So when I talk about threats and things that are conflictual, I want you to just in your head list off maybe what you think would be one of the leading causes of a perceived threat in a conversation. Just take a moment. And you might be thinking something like accusations, raised voices, overt threats, maybe somebody throwing something. Those would all be definite threats in a conversation, but actually it's not the most common thing in a conversation that we perceive to be dangerous. One of the most common tactics we use in an argument or conflict to try to prove our point or make our case, and research shows that this can increase our anxiety by over 40%. It's a question. A threat is as simple as searching for the right answer to a question. So let's go back to our example of a teenager. During this stage, like we said, autonomy is one of the needs that they really thrive off of. So they're trying to figure out who they are, what is it that they value, how do they come across in this world. They're wanting to be independent. They don't want to be controlled by other people. They're starting to make their own choices. And on top of that, their brains aren't fully developed. So that rationalizing behavior but not rational, that's more of the norm rather than the exception. So let's just imagine you're with this teenager and innocently, because you're wanting to connect with them, which again, that's a need, you go, hey, how was your day? What did you learn at school? And they might sense this as danger, like perhaps you're trying to control them or elicit information that they don't want to give. And so all of a sudden they get really big and they're like, why do you always ask me these questions? Like, why do you need to know everything? And then they stomp out of the room and you're kind of going, what just happened? But the thing is that the brain sees that question as danger. And so they feel like they're in a trap and they react accordingly. So that kind of ends the part about our brain. And since all of you are now certified neuroscientists, we'll use all of this information and we'll bring it into difficult conversations. So if you would, I want you to just think back to a difficult conversation that you may have had with somebody before. And this could be a spouse, a partner, a family member, parent, sibling, teacher, boss, friend, anybody. Just think back to a difficult conversation that you had with somebody where you feel pretty confident that you can remember most of the facts in the situation. Or large chunks of the conversation. And as you're bringing up those pieces in the conversation, I want you to think from your perspective, what were the facts in that conversation? Okay, so that would be kind of doing this run through of, well, he said this and then I said this, or she wanted to do this and I wanted to do that, or I did this, you did that. Okay, so these are kind of the details of the conversation. So just think about what the facts are. And then I'm going to ask you to be a little bit courageous, and I want you to think back to the conversation and as honestly and accurately as you can, put yourself in the other person's shoes. And I want you to imagine how that person would describe the facts of the conversation. So not like your perspective, but how they would describe their perspective. If they were sitting here, they would say, no, these were the facts of the conversation. Okay, and if I could see you, this would be even better, but raise your hand if, when you think through the experience of the facts of the situation, and then you think through the experience and the facts of the situation from the other person's perspective, how many of you came up with the exact same facts? Like 100%. Anyone? And I know I can't see you, but I would guess that nobody is raising their hand in this moment. And because we have different perspectives, right? So when we think to a conversation, we go, what are the real facts of a conversation? And really the only fact that we can count on is that the conversation happened. That's it. As we can tell, even from this short exercise that we did, even when we think that we're being clear and factual, there's always another side coming in. And so a lot of times we think, well, if we could just get down to the facts or the brass tacks and get things clear cut and factual, then I can prove my point, I can make my case, I can get the other person to do what I'm asking them to do or even change their mind, or maybe I'll even compromise in this situation. But we all have perceptions of the facts, and then we have our own meanings that we assign to the perception of our facts. So most of us carry around our own ideals and moral codes with us all of the time. And it can actually feel like a very negative experience when we encounter somebody who holds different values or different beliefs and opinions than we do. And sometimes it can even feel threatening. So you think sometimes it might bring us to this place of questioning, like, do I belong in a relationship with this person? Should I stay connected to this person? Am I emotionally and physically safe with this person? Am I going to actually be able to maintain being freely who I am, because we have these differing opinions? And so out of this kind of that thinking, we oftentimes then start to make assumptions and put up walls of protection. And we may start to sway a little bit more towards a dualistic type of thinking. So you're either right or wrong. You agree or disagree. It's yes or no, bad or good. And when we do that, this then becomes our default response, and we miss a lot of communication and information and start to make a lot of assumptions that probably aren't correct. And that means we're operating then from a very limited viewpoint. And so when we bring it back to that picture of the brain, I'll just pull this up over here, okay? This is oftentimes when the disconnect starts to happen. And like we talked about before, when the disconnect happens, then we're prone to respond with those defense mechanisms that aren't always the most helpful in trying to have a difficult conversation. A woman named Dr. Marilee Adams, who's the president of the Inquiry Institute, talks about two different paths that we can take when we're in a difficult experience or difficult conversation. And so her research talks about asking the right kind of questions, which may seem a little bit weird because I just got done saying that questions actually can be seen as very threatening, and that is true. But the anxiety that increases when a question asks actually only increases when we perceive that that question is embedded with judgment. And if we're honest, a lot of times questions are embedded with judgment. So Dr. Adams talks about using the skill of inquiry and asking different types of questions when those difficult conversations arise, so that everybody can feel like they're being heard and listened to and understood, and that a solution can be come up with that fits everybody's needs. So Dr. Adams talks about two different types of people when difficult conversations arise. She talks about the judger, or the judging path, and the learner, or the learning path. So the judger role or judger path is our automatic response or reaction. It's something that's a very habitual pattern of ours. It's actually our default mode, and it's pretty heavily connected with the reptilian and mammalian part of the brain. The role of the judger is very instinctual, and it recognizes two things. First, that something happened, and then secondly, that it's wrong. And wrong is actually just a code word for a threat or a danger. And remember that reptilian and mammalian part of the brain are constantly scanning for danger. So when something is wrong, then the judger role starts to look for somebody to blame. Whose fault is it? And the judger starts to ask questions like, what's wrong with that person? How could they make that decision? Or maybe you turn the questions inward and you go, what's wrong with me? Why do I always do this? Or why does this always happen to me? Why is this other person so stupid? How could they think X, Y, or Z? But ultimately, when we ask those types of questions, it leads us to a lot of feelings of shame and failure and apathy, hopelessness, and something else that's very dangerous, a false narrative. And for those of you who don't know what a false narrative is a story that we tell ourselves that likely isn't true, but definitely is not 100% true. But it's based off of assumptions, a limited viewpoint, and the need to protect ourselves. But isn't this oftentimes what we do in a difficult conversation? Sometimes we do it right in the moment, under our breath, silently, while the other person is talking. Sometimes we even say it out loud, and we may say things that we regret later, all because we're on that judging path and we're trying to protect ourselves. But the problem is, if we hold a belief internally that somebody is bad or dumb or stupid, wrong, morally failing, etc., then we oftentimes begin to feel mad and frustrated and toxic and rigid, and maybe even that we would want to hurt ourselves or someone else. And that, of course, then creates moods of pessimism and stress and limitations and defensive behaviors, inflexibility, everything except for bonding and connecting behaviors. And it just continues to feed that message back to the reptilian and mammalian part of the brain that we are in danger. So that's the judger path. The second path that Dr. Adams talks about is the learner role or the learner path. And this is the path that seeks to respond to a situation instead of reacting. So just a quick note on the difference between those two. When we react to a situation, we are actually out of control. A reaction is completely based off of the actions or words or emotion of somebody else. It's kind of that, well, she did this, so I'm going to do this. And so we're constantly waiting for them to say or think or feel or do something, and then we react based off of what they did. But the problem is we're constantly dependent on somebody else then to react, and so we really don't win in this situation. Responding, however, comes from a much higher value of self. So it recognizes that the people around us can say or do or think or feel whatever they want, and they can even do it in a really gross and aggressive and ugly way. But our next move, our response, comes from a higher value of self. And so it's independent of what that other person is doing or saying or thinking. And so the learner role, you're asking different questions when that conflict or difficult conversation arises. So you're starting to ask yourself, what assumptions am I making? What are the other people in this scenario thinking or wanting? What's important to me? What is motivating me? What am I responsible for? And what is the other person responsible for? What can I learn from this experience? What are my choices? What would I like to see happen? And what's actually possible from this point? So you can tell even by that list of questions that these are very different questions that we're asking, and we're getting very different responses when we do. But this line of questioning and that learner path actually requires a lot of practice because it's not our natural inclination when we feel that something's wrong. So this role requires us to make active and intentional choices to do something different rather than our automatic reactions. So most of us have figured out by this point in life that the only person in this world that we ever have control over is ourselves. And that's usually for good reason. But even in a difficult conversation, you might be doing everything quote unquote right, and the other person is still allowed to act or react, say or do whatever they want to do. And so it's for this reason that I can't simply give you a list of 10 things or a step-by-step guide on how to have a difficult conversation with someone, because there's always another person that we have to take into account. But I can help you develop some tools for yourself that you can utilize in a difficult conversation, regardless of what the other person is doing or saying or acting, and you can feel good about yourself and that you're going about it in a different way. So the first thing that we can ask ourselves when we find ourselves in the midst of a difficult conversation is, what path am I on right now? Am I in the learning path or am I on the judging path? So am I feeling like I need to defend myself or prove a point, argue a case, get louder, or run away or make some below the belt hits? Or do I feel like I can take that kind of proverbial step back and see things from another perspective and see what's going on here? The nice part about the judging path is that at any point you can pause and redirect and go back onto the learner path. And all you have to do in order to do that is realize that you're on the judging path and make the conscious choice to move over to the learning path and start asking different questions. The second thing that you can do is asking yourself, what's going on inside of me right now? So, am I feeling misunderstood? Am I feeling like somebody is trying to take control of me? Do I feel safe in this situation? Can I show up as myself? Am I feeling accepted? So you'll see that a lot of these questions go with those 6 basic needs that we try to have met as human beings. And sometimes just simply identifying what need it is that you're wanting to get met that isn't being met is enough for us to kind of decrease that defensiveness and redirect in that conversation. The next thing that you can do is evaluate the assumptions you're making. So, am I assuming that something that's important to me is also important to you? Am I assuming that the things that I'm saying mean exactly what you think that I'm saying? Are you perceiving it in the same way? Or am I assuming or expecting you to play a role or meet a need that is unfair of me to expect for you to meet? So assumptions are a big thing to take into consideration, because a lot of times that's where we can get a little bit messed up and we go, well, I'm assuming this is because it's important to me, it's important to you. And that's not always the case. So check your assumptions. Next is divvying up your responsibilities. So I'm going to figure out what part in this is mine. I'm going to be responsible for that. And then I'm going to figure out what is the other person's role. What are they responsible for? We know that communication is a two-way street, and we never need to be responsible for the words and actions of others, but we do have to be responsible for our words and our actions. And it might mean that we have to make some changes, some necessary changes, some difficult changes when we take responsibility for ourselves. And it might mean that we even have to change independent of if that other person is changing. Actually, it's regardless if that other person changes or not. We always have to accept our own responsibility. The next question to ask is, what's the inverse? So most of us as humans don't naturally gravitate towards a reference point outside of our own. We don't really know what all of the facts are in a situation. But when we're in that situation, when we feel stressed or when we're in danger, that's when we start to kind of put those blinders on a little bit, and we can only see from our narrow little viewpoint. And when that happens, we do start to behave in ways that don't necessarily serve our relationships or conversations. So when we talk about the inverse, what we're asking, what is the inverse of what we're thinking? So an example of that might be you're in a difficult conversation and all you can think of is, oh my gosh, this other person is so narrow-minded. The inverse is, what if I'm narrow-minded? And if that's true, what does that change? How does that change things? So when we allow ourselves to take different viewpoints from what we naturally hold, that is one of the most fundamental capacities of somebody who is a higher functioning individual. So asking what the inverse is incredibly important. The next piece is being aware of yourself. So that's starting to notice what is your response to the situation at hand, and starting to ask yourself, what are the beliefs and ideas that I have in this situation, and maybe where are they even coming from? Maybe it's asking yourself honestly if there's any other way other than your own that produces an acceptable outcome. And also bringing awareness to yourself in this situation is reminding yourself constantly that different is not wrong. Like I said before, so many times when we come across differences, we perceive them as wrong, and then wrong means danger, and we go into that whole cycle. But that isn't what different means. Different means different. It doesn't mean wrong or bad or negative. It just means different. So when we can have that awareness that something is different or somebody is different, and know that it's just different and it's not wrong, then we can engage in the situation in a different way. And finally, if you need to, ask for a timeout. So I mentioned earlier that when we start to feel endangered or threatened or uncomfortable or overwhelmed, that's when our neocortex starts to go offline. And when we start to notice this happening, that's maybe our cue then to be able to ask the person we're having a conversation with if we can take a 20-minute break. and then come back to the conversation. And when we have that 20 minutes, that's when we can refocus our attention, ask some of those learner questions, and then re-enter the conversation. And one of the best ways to know that our neocortex is starting to go offline is when we start to engage in one of those 3 coping mechanisms of fight, flight, or freeze. So when we start to notice ourselves get really, really big or really, really small and wanting to leave the situation, that's our cue to go, hey, I'm becoming disconnected and I either need to take a physical break from this situation or take a kind of a step back in my mind and realign so that I can stay engaged in a healthy way. I know that I've thrown a lot of information at you, and I'm sure there's many of you listening to this who actually see all this information as a threat because you're just getting so overwhelmed and you want to shut this video off as soon as possible. And others of you might feel overwhelmed and wonder, how am I going to start this? This is so much that we've talked about. And so I'll just end with this. Practice makes perfect. The more that you do these things and they become a habit, the easier that it is to be able to engage in conversations and relationships in a healthy way. And if I can add, I actually might encourage you to start doing these things in non-difficult moments and in non-difficult conversations. These are wonderful skills to have anyways. And so if we're practicing this on the regular, when we get into those difficult moments and those difficult conversations, we've already trained our mind to ask the different questions, to remain present, to be aware, to be checking our assumptions, and it makes the conversation go so much easier. So I'm very hopeful that the things that we talked about today are the things that you can now try to implement when you are having difficult conversations. Thank you so much for listening.